Alright, y'all, so welcome back to SDG. And a quick side note before we get into the video, I'm a little sick right now and I have been for the past 2 weeks. I've been kind of postponing this video for a while, or at least just recording the audio for it. But, yeah, so if you hear me, breathing through my mouth and, sounding like a big body, big back brontosaurus through the mic, just letting you know that's why. And, also, hey, there's one more thing I was going to say, I forgot. Oh well, we'll be fine. But yeah, let's go ahead and get right into the video. This right here is my presentation of a few of the arguments I think belong on the main Christian apologetics iceberg. Let's go. Imagine this: the year is 30 or 33 AD, and from all it seems, all is normal. The Passover festival was in full spring, and another would-be Messiah was just crucified, executed by the Romans, ending his movement just like the dozens of others before him. Except a few months later, his followers are back. They're not scattered, not trying to go back to their old lives as most would, but instead they're proclaiming something quite odd: his resurrection. Now, if you're a normal person, you might just immediately wonder, hey, is there any evidence for this? Or, have these men just simply gone crazy? But hey, lo and behold, the tomb in which the man lied is indeed empty. Of course, the earliest argument to this would have been, hey, these guys have simply stolen the body. But what's actually fascinating is that the earlier disciples would have likely reminded people that the tomb was being heavily guarded by guards at the time, and the body could not have just been stolen. This instance, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, is widely considered to be one of the earliest Christian apologies of all time. And just about a century and a little bit of change after this, Justin Martyr, my profile picture, would write the earliest full Christian apology around 155 to 157 that we know of. And throughout the course of Christian history, many arguments have arisen for the reliability of the Gospels, God's existence, and for Jesus' resurrection. And today I plan to go over just a few of these apologetic arguments, going for more common to more niche and complex. So yeah, without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting at the tip of the iceberg, we have what's probably the most commonly known argument for Christianity: the classic liar, lunatic, or Lord. Now this is a simple trilemma popularized by C.S. Lewis in the 1900s in his famous book, Mere Christianity. It's a simple argument that makes the claim that if Jesus did the things he did in the Bible, that he is either a liar who died knowing that he wouldn't come back and that he was lying, or a lunatic who thought he truly was the Messiah and still managed to be such a great teacher, or he truly was the Messiah and thus truly is the Lord. Next up is the simple assertion that Jesus was a real historical person, and this is accepted by almost all scholars, Christian or not. I just want to point that out. Now, just below that, I have the argument that all the writings of the New Testament were written in the first century and therefore were early and close to the events that they describe. Now, some scholars might try to argue for a second century dating of Acts based on, some reliance on Josephus's work that they interpret to be, which was indeed written down near the end of the first century. But there are a lot of responses to this, and we'll actually get into a few of them later in the video. But just know that this is currently not the scholarly consensus, though it is gaining some momentum. There's also a very common argument for the internal consistency of the Bible that points to, the 40 plus authors across three different continents, three different languages, and thousands of years. I won't get into detail on this one because it's very heavily disputed on a lot of these things, and it's also just a very broad argument, and I really just don't think that I can do it justice in a short amount of time. So I apologize for that. For the last argument in the tip, I placed Pascal's wager. Now, I just want to clear up a few misconceptions because originally this thing wasn't really even an argument. It was more of a thought experiment. Basically, in 1600s France, the culture that Pascal did live in, which is the person who created the argument, deism and Christianity were really the only two games in town, right? So it was never really meant to argue against an atheist or agnostic or Muslim or anything like that, someone who's considering multiple religions or anything like that, right? But still, today this is a very common argument, and to just lay it out really simply for you guys, it's more complex than this. But to put it simply, basically just says that that if God exists, right, and you believe in Him, you have the potential to gain eternal life, right? But if He doesn't exist and you believe in Him, well, you didn't really lose much, besides maybe some pleasure or something in this life, right? But if He doesn't exist and you don't believe in Him, you face eternal judgment. And again, if you if he doesn't exist and you didn't believe in him, well, again, you didn't really gain or lose much. You might have just gained a few more pleasure points, I guess, or something like that. But yeah, that's just basically how that argument goes. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to the surface level arguments, things that your average civilian may or may not know, but are still very common in the general knowledge of general apologetics. Now, first up for this one, I have the Kalam cosmological argument. It basically argues that everything that has a beginning has a cause, and since you know that the universe had a beginning, it must have had a cause. And this cause, by necessity, would have to be outside of things like time and space and matter, and therefore would most align with God. Now, next to it, I have the archaeological evidence for the New Testament. This includes discoveries like the Pool of Siloam and the Pilate Stone. Now, before these discoveries, a lot of scholars held to a much more legendy type view of the Gospels, especially for John, and they doubted things like the existence of Pilate. And basically, when things like the Pilate Stone were discovered and the Pool of Siloam, this basically they just showed up and they were like, "Hey, this isn't just some random myth crafted up by some random guy," and it helps to root the Gospels in more of a historical event and at least give leeway or just a little extra oomph, to the reliability of the Gospels. Now, next up, I've got the minimal facts approach. Now, this was popularized by Mike Licona recently and mostly developed by Gary Habermas in the 1970s. This approach, tries to prove Jesus' resurrection based on a few key facts or minimal facts that almost all scholars agree upon, namely that Jesus existed, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that his disciples truly did think that he rose and did see him, whether or not that be visions or however else they interpret it, right? And that the tomb was found empty. That one's a little more disputed, though, but the scholarly consensus is that it was found empty, I believe. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this approach. I mean, I think it does a great job of getting the average person to at least stop and think about the evidence and start, taking Christian claims a little bit more seriously. But in academia, I know that there's a lot of arguments that scholars make against it, mainly focusing on the nature of these appearances after death and gradual development hypothesis. Even though I think this argument has a lot of problems, it's still just a great argument for at least getting people's foot in the door with Christian apologetics. And this is actually, the first argument that I was exposed to, I think, when it comes to, the kind of slightly deeper, I guess you could say, side of Christianity. Next up, I have the fact that intrinsic religiosity, or more specifically Christianity, leads to better societies. Now, this isn't really an argument, but more of just a response to something like the meager moral fruits argument, or simply just another thought piece, depending on how you look at it. Now, this one can be quite controversial, as I'm sure you know if you scrolled any bit on TikTok, because one, a lot of people have bad experiences with church and such, and two, because of the things like witch hunts and the conflict slash dark ages myth that virtually all historians reject today, might add. For more, I've heard that the historian Tom Holland has a good book on this called Dominion, but I haven't read it myself, so I'll hold off on judgments for that. But to put it simply, Christianity leads to things like citizen empowerment, voice and accountability, charity work, and lower interstate armed conflict. Josephus and Tacitus is another very popular talking point among the Christian apologetics community. Now, both of these people were non Christian historians who mentioned the historical Jesus very early on, with Josephus' first mention of Jesus dating to around 94 AD in his work Antiquities of the Jews. Although there is some debate on whether or not this work has been touched up a little bit by a later Christian scribe. Now, just below Josephus and Tacitus, I have the fine-tuning argument. Now, this basically argues that the universe needs to be specifically fine-tuned for life, often citing things like the complex equations that make up the universe and the very small margin of things like gravitational forces that even make life or anything in the universe possible. Atheists usually tend to rate the fine-tuning argument as one of the most convincing, although there are some objections to this, but again, I think that these can be resolved. Next up, I've got the criteria of embarrassment. Now, this is just a simple little method used by historians to help basically just tip the scales in direction of, yeah, this is a real event that they're talking about here in an ancient document. It basically just suggests that a detail would have been embarrassing for the authors, like women finding the tomb of Jesus. It's more likely that it's true or that it did happen, because it's more unlikely that an author would invent something that hurts their agenda or goes against the story that they're trying to tell. Now, coming up on the last argument I have for the surface level tier, I have the moral argument. Now, this basically asserts that objective morality exists and that God is the best explanation of this. I think that this is a very good at forcing people to really bite the bullet on certain things, kind of similar to what Trent Horn did against Destiny in his debate against abortion. For example, there have been plenty of debates where moral relativists have had to admit that, the bad German guys were not objectively in the wrong. But now moving on into slightly deeper waters, and first up, I've got the maximal data approach. Now, this is actually one of my favorites, as it's basically like a heavyweight version of the minimal facts argument. It goes on the offensive by arguing that the Gospels are reliable eyewitness accounts and that we should treat them as such. Now, the YouTube channel Testify has a couple of good videos on this topic, and I highly recommend them, as I can't get into all the data that goes into the maximal data approach, because of course it uses, the max amount of data in the approach. Now, right beside it, I think I've placed the ontological argument, and I think that this argument is very fascinating, and it pretty much just argues that God has to exist because He is the greatest conceivable being, and to exist is greater than not to exist. Thus, God has to exist. Again, I find it very interesting, and as you've probably noticed, it doesn't really rely on any physical or hard evidence. It's more of a, I guess, philosophical argument, and it draws heavy on logic and stuff, and I'm sure it's quite controversial. Again, I haven't really looked too deep into this one, but yeah, that's the ontological argument, simplified, very simplified version. Now, an argument that I think is pretty similar to this one is actually called presuppositionalism. It basically argues that the very logic that we use to discuss topics like this are only reliable if God exists, because without him, our thoughts and logic are simply just chemical responses in our brain. As Charles Darwin himself put it, but then the horror or doubt always arises within me whether the convictions of a man mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are any at all trustworthy or of value. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind, for example, if there even are convictions in such a mind? So another argument is the early dating of the Gospels. Now I won't go too deep into all the reasons why many argue this, but I will hit on a key few points. Now a few of these points are Luke not reporting on the death of Paul in the book of Acts, which was that Paul's martyrdom was around 64 to 65 AD after building up to the fate of Paul, meaning Acts likely dates to around 63 64 AD. Now, because Acts is actually the second part of the Gospel of Luke, you can see this in the address to Theophilus in the beginning of both of the books in the Bible. Luke has to date to a little before, and because Luke uses Mark and Matthew as a source, they both have to date early as well. Now, some estimates actually put Mark and Matthews into the early 50s or even the late 40s, which is drastically shorter than the post 70 AD scholarly consensus that most secular scholars hold to, which again is largely based on the prediction of the destruction of the temple. But again, I won't go too deep into this because there are a lot of arguments and back and forth discussions on these type of things. Okay, so now for the final argument in the slightly deeper tier, I place the undesigned coincidences type of thing. Now, this argument originally dates all the way back to William Paley in the 1700s. Now, basically, this argument just points out small little details like how one author may make a report that doesn't seem to might quite make sense, but then another author comes in and casually fills in the details without even reporting on the original report. An example of this can be found in John chapter 6, verse 5, when Jesus asked Philip, where they can buy some bread. Now, this seems a little odd because Philip, to say the least, isn't really the most popular disciple, but Luke has filled it in by mentioning that this miracle took place in Bethesda, and without even mentioning Jesus asking Philip for bread. And we can see this in John chapter 1, verse 44. We see that Philip was actually from Bethesda. So basically, Luke acts like a puzzle piece to solve this kind of mystery in the feeding of the 5,000 in John. And there are dozens more of these all throughout the Bible. Again, I think Testify has some really good videos on this. I think he's got a whole series on this actually with like 70 different videos. So I highly recommend that one too. Now we're starting to get into some more deep waters. These arguments are even more niche and complex, and I think even a few books have been written on these arguments alone. But first off, I'll start with onomastic congruence. Now, I actually just recently heard about this argument a few months ago from an inspiring philosophy video. Go subscribe to him. This argument basically compares the names we find in Gospels to the names that we found from graves and scrolls that kept names during that time to see, what the names match up to what we'd expect to see from that if it was events from that time. And what's crazy is the Gospels scored remarkably well on this and are exactly what we expect from a report that about events that took time at that time and place, suggesting that the authors either were there or working with real eyewitness testimony and not just some later on legends. For more, again, inspiring philosophy has a great video on this, and I think Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitness, which I actually got right here, goes more into detail into this in his book as well. But yeah, that's automatic congruence. Next up, I have one that I find really interesting, honestly. It's the Gulf Oasis theory. Now, this one is pretty complicated, and of course, I can't explain it all in one video as opposed to these. But again, Inspiring Philosophy has a really good video on this. But basically, this argument is just saying that if we use like satellite imagery and things like that, we can see from about 10,000 years ago how the world was, right? And specifically around the Persian Gulf. We can see, um, we can basically reconstruct kind of where the Garden of Eden might have been, and it's actually eerily similar to what we see in the Bible. We can actually see that Genesis provides a great detailed reconstruction of the ancient world from 10,000 years ago, and this just once again just shows that they were likely working with some very old oral traditions, and of course it doesn't necessarily prove anything on its own, but it definitely just gives again just more and more to that accumulative case that the Bible is reliable. The Bible is a reliable book, and once again, Inspired Philosophy has a great video on this. I think there's also been a few books about it. I know that for sure there's a lot of reports and things of that nature of it. I think it's fairly popular, honestly, nowadays at least. So I'm sure you can go online and just kind of look up some things and just kind of see what you see. So yeah, I definitely suggest looking more into this one. The next one up is the hard problem or the consciousness problem. Now, people often mistake this one for a simple God of the gaps argument, right? But Christians often argue that consciousness can't come from the mind. So it's not just we don't know how it's coming from the mind, therefore God did it. No, it's that we assert that it can't come from the mind and therefore has to come from something immaterial, being it's not the material universe and all that, and that puts the odd, right? But again, this one is very complex, and I'll leave it up to the people who actually study this stuff to actually solve this. So, yeah, I definitely recommend looking deeper into this, but just know it's a deep rabbit hole. Okay, now we're going to talk about Luke's geography. Now, again, I found out about this because of the YouTube channel Testify. I think I mentioned him a little bit earlier when I was talking about undesigned coincidences, but he has a lot of great videos on the reliability of acts that I'd highly recommend. Especially because Acts is kind of under talked about a lot when we talk about Christian apologetics or even just Christianity in general. But still, this argument is about once again how skilled Luke as a historian was, and just points out Luke's geography and how accurate he was. For example, we see with the island of Malta, with the whole shipwrecking thing and Paul getting bitten by the venomous snake and stuff, right? Um, a lot of historians, right, they knew where Malta was, but Luke is the one who actually gets up in there and provides the great details and gets it spot on, right? And even then, we saw multiple mistakes with the island of Malta and stuff. So, but Luke is the one who gets it right, right? And he gets a lot of other things right too, like the routines of a soldier whenever like the ship was about to sink or something like that. He gets a lot of those right, and it's just a whole bunch of things that build up once again to an accumulative case. Not one thing just proving something instantly, but it's an accumulative case that just points out again and again and again. Hey, this stuff you wouldn't really be expecting to see, if it wasn't eyewitness, but again, it's just making it more and more hard to think that this stuff is just legend. So, but yeah, I highly recommend checking out Testify's videos on this and looking deeper into this topic. Okay, so this one is extremely complicated, and honestly, I might have to go back and make a video just on this topic alone. But I'm just for the sake of the video, man. We're talking about metaphysics here. I'm just gonna provide like one, like, I guess, argument from the metaphysics tier. Now, and this is actually the final argument in this category before we get to even deeper stuff, um, but yeah, so this is simply about some simple-ish, you could say, metaphysics. Now, again, I do not know a lot at all about this stuff, so I'm just gonna straight up read the Google AI overview of this, okay? And I quote, "The argument from abstract objects, numbers like 7, or the logic of A cannot be B, aren't made up of atoms. You can't find them in a lab, comma, yet they are true everywhere in the universe. These things aren't physical. Where do they live? Apologists argue that they must exist in a transcendent mind. If there's no God, it's just a massive coincidence that the physical world perfectly obeys these invisible, non-physical mathematical laws." End quote. So yeah, that's the deep waters tier, and that's my Google AI overview read off of metaphysics. So yeah. Finally, we're down to the dark depths tier. Here we have the heaviest and the most controversial arguments for Christianity. First up, the Shroud of Turin and the carbon-14 reevaluation. Now, 1988 carbon-14 testing revealed that the shroud should date to around the Middle Ages, highly suggesting that it's a forgery. However, research has revealed that there was a potentially major flaw in the study, namely that the part tested was a contaminated edge of the shroud, and that part was mended in the Middle Ages after potential damage to it was done. It's one of a few others like the 1532 fire and also incorrect protocol while testing the samples. Not only that, but with new methods like wide-angle X-ray scattering, they apparently dated the shroud all the way back to the 1st century, aka Jesus' time. But again, it should be noted that wide-angle X-ray scattering done on the shroud is pretty controversial, and contamination also causes a concern on both this method as well as the other method as well. Now, for the second out of the three in the dark depths tier, we have an extremely controversial one. This is called the Bayesian theory models, right? Now, this is basically just a big math problem to determine probability. This argument goes that if we stack the prior probability of God existing and then add the rest of the evidence, like the resurrection, like the empty tomb and the gospel reliability, we see the probability of Jesus rising from the dead is extremely high, even up to the high 90%. I've even seen as high as like 97%. Now, while I definitely think that this is a fascinating argument, it could be a useful tool if we could develop it more and redefine our starting positions a little bit. Of course, there are some big problems with this one, mostly regarding the somewhat arbitrary assigning of probability to things, such as God's existence in the empty tomb. Again, for the metaphysics stuff, I'm just gonna read the Google AI overview because again, I don't know anything about this stuff, but I felt like it was a big enough thing to where I should probably just put it in the iceberg, just so that I guess kind of do it justice. But yeah. So let's get right into it. As I quote, ontology of God, exploring God not as just a being among other beings, but as being subsistent itself, actus purus, the necessary foundation that prevents the universe from collapsing into non-existence at any given moment. End quote. All right, y'all boys. Thank you so much. Genuinely, if you watched this video from the bottom of my heart, I genuinely thank you. Even if you just skip to the end of the video, a view is a view. You know what I'm saying? But I've actually yet to get any sort of interaction or motion with my videos, like or a comment or anything. So if you like the video, you want to drop a like, I greatly appreciate that. Or you can just comment down below like what you thought of the video, things I should improve upon, stuff like that. But or what you want to see next, stuff like that, right? But in the meantime, I got more videos planned. I'm just glad I decided to finally go into the deep end and start trying to make a little bit better content. But hey, God bless y'all, and hey, I'm gonna go to sleep now. Hey, glory to God, GTG. Make this true, it don't gotta be a song. I know you still got my number, and you want me for so long. Are you waiting? Don't tell me I'm lying. It's all in your eyes. This is the perfect timing. I know you're waiting. I'm already dying. It's all on your face. I'm the reason you're crying. Are you waiting? Don't tell me I'm lying. It's all in your eyes. This is the perfect timing.